If you remember, we started this second third of the class by talking about the Great Depression and the response to that by Franklin Roosevelt with the New Deal. And we talked about this New Deal being a tremendous change in how the government related to the people. For the first time in history, really, the federal government was becoming more expansive. It was becoming involved in various facets of American life, whether it be in terms of the economy, the workplace, or in matters of health, even with things like Social Security and retirement and so on. Well, as we also talked about, the New Deal declined dramatically after 1937. And for the most part, even though liberalism, the key underlying ideology of the New Deal, even though liberalism would remain supreme for essentially the next 30 years, the liberal program of the New Deal would suffer throughout that same period. Most politicians, New Dealers, if you will, struggled to keep those expansive programs of the New Deal alive and build on them in succeeding decades. Well, this will change somewhat in the 1960s with the rise of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. When we were talking about the 1950s in a previous class, we described that decade as a decade of affluence. We talked about American families who, for the first time in several decades, after experiencing first the Great Depression and then the rationing of World War II, were able to buy things for the first times. We talked about the growth of suburbia, where people bought their homes and then they filled their homes with a bunch of material objects, whether it be televisions, whether it be vacuums, we watched the commercial, whether it be washing machines, whatever. People were living in the laps of luxury. But here's the thing, as all of this affluence was spreading across the nation, we still see pockets of people struggling, particularly in urban areas, but also in rural areas. In Appalachia, down south, for instance, is a big area where a lot of poverty exists. But most Americans sort of push that aside and they don't think about those pockets of poverty. Well, by the early 1960s, this hiding from the poverty in America is made more difficult due to the publication in 1963 of The Other America by Michael Harrington. So I wanted to start a discussion here today by talking about this book and its impact on U.S. policy and how it helped spur the Great Society later in the decade. So we're actually going to begin the story here in July of 1959, because in that month of that year, Commentary magazine published an article by Michael Harrington. And the title of that article was Are 50 Million Poor? So Michael Harrington in this article, Are 50 Million Poor, used $3,000 as his poverty level. And with using this $3,000 as his poverty level, he found that between 40 and 60 million Americans had been living in poverty in 1959. Now, that number alone is extraordinary in and of itself, but it becomes more so when you consider the population of America in 1959, which was 180 million people, excuse me. Thus, if we look at the numbers, that means that nearly 1/3 of all Americans were living in poverty in 1959. Clearly, this is not the affluent society that a lot of Americans were led to believe. Well, in 1962, Harrington decided that he was going to expand the article into a book, and that book received very little attention, and it was known as The Other America. And it received very little attention, in fact, until 1963, early 1963, when the New Yorker magazine published a 13,000-word review. And this 13,000-word review was entitled Our Invisible Poor. Our Invisible Poor. And this was, in fact, the longest book review ever published in the magazine. So what this book review did was it caught the attention of far more people than the book itself. And one of those persons who read, one of the people in America who read this review was Walter Heller. Walter Heller was John F. Kennedy's chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. And he actually gave the president a copy of McDonald's review, the 13,000 word book review that appeared in the New Yorker magazine. So Kennedy was shocked by what he read in this review that he picked up from Harrington's book, and as a result, he would introduce a legislative poverty program. But as he did with so many other issues, including civil rights, as we'll talk about in future lectures, he did nothing after he introduced it. Therefore, he would leave this effort in dealing with poverty to his successor, Lyndon Johnson. In order to understand Lyndon Johnson and the reasons that he had for building this great society, as he called it, we need to understand a little bit about his individual biography and his individual past. So Lyndon Johnson, during his youth, served as a director of the National Youth Administration beginning in 1935. The National Youth Administration was created by Franklin Roosevelt during the New Deal to provide unemployed young Americans with educational and vocational training as well as jobs. Lyndon Johnson would, 2 years later, decide that he wanted to become a politician himself. So therefore, he would actually win a special election in 1937 and become a member of the National House of Representatives. And as a representative from the state of Texas for the National House of Representatives, he voted in favor of every piece of New Deal legislation. In fact, so much so that one of Franklin Roosevelt's assistants described Lyndon Johnson as, in his words, a perfect Roosevelt man. Lyndon Johnson would eventually win election to the Senate, becoming the Senate Majority Leader and a very powerful and assertive figure in that capacity. And he would eventually run for presidency in 1960. He would not get very far in the process, and instead he would become John F. Kennedy's vice president. Well, for much of the 1940s and 1950s, as I alluded to in the introduction to this lecture, the New Deal type programs failed to pass Congress. And John F. Kennedy as president really accepted this lack of initiative at the congressional level, so John F. Kennedy really did not push through a lot of legislation during his presidency, whether it be the poverty legislation that I alluded to earlier or the civil rights legislation that we'll talk about later in the semester. But nonetheless, this would change when Lyndon Johnson became president, albeit quite briefly. But nonetheless, you do have to realize that Lyndon Johnson's past in the Senate as a power broker, if you will, really gave him some authority to get this stuff through Congress, in addition to the Congress becoming more liberal during the 1960s. But we do have to ask this question here that we see on this lecture slide. Was the Great Society a New Deal Part 2, if you will? Was it the revival of the New Deal? Now, leave no doubt about it, the Great Society was just as aggressive as the New Deal in terms of believing that the government had a role to play in everyday life. But at the same time, we see the Great Society being a little more conservative than the New Deal. And now, before we get into the discussion about the conservatism of the Great Society, I do want to talk about when the Great Society really was. If you look at in terms of legislation passed, the Great Society was really a brief period in U.S. history. From about 1964 until 1966 is when the majority of Johnson's Great Society programs were passed. But now, like I said, I want to turn into what was the general ideology behind these programs. And if we look closer, what we see is the following. Johnson's Great Society was somewhat more conservative than Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. So for instance, I want to describe this debate that goes on within the Johnson administration between two individuals. On one side, you had Secretary of Labor Willard Wirtz, and he was going off against the head of the Council of Economic Advisors, the individual that we talked about previously in this lecture, Walter Heller. So here were the two different sides in this debate. The Secretary of Labor, Willard Wirtz, advocated a return to the public works projects of the New Deal. And in fact, his Labor Department would propose spending anywhere from between $3 to $5 billion for a jobs program. President Johnson, however, as it turned out, ignored such pleas, wanting instead to cut taxes and actually rein in slow government spending. So therefore, he was very much encouraged when Walter Heller, the head of the Council of Economic Advisors, put forth an alternative. Heller rejected expensive plans to create public jobs, preferring instead a more modest approach that would allocate, meaning give, federal money to local governments and citizen-run organizations so that they could design plans that best fit their own local realities. So in short, what we see with Heller is not only a lower number in terms of the amount of money spent, but also a reduced role for the national government, giving much more power to local groups and local politicians to determine where this money went and for what purposes it went to. So therefore, in short, what we see, Johnson preferred sort of a pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality, as he described it in a conversation with one of his officials, Sergeant Shriver. Lyndon Johnson wanted, in his words, a hand up, not a handout, meaning he wanted to help people get to work. He didn't want to put them on welfare and be reliant on government. And we see this, in fact, with all of the legislation that was passed during the Great Society. Its initial budget was only $500 million for the new War on Poverty programs. So clearly, this is not a big government thing, at least in comparison to the New Deal, where billions of dollars were spent over the course of the New Deal. Numbers would never reach that level here in the 1960s during the course of the Great Society and its war on poverty. So let's talk about both the war on poverty itself and the larger Great Society. Now I want to just make a note organizationally. Part of the Great Society, a very large and important part of the Great Society, was obviously some of the civil rights legislation that was passed by Lyndon Johnson, most notably the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. We're not going to talk about that now because I want to leave it for the lecture on civil rights, but I just want to acknowledge and have you be aware that these two pieces of legislation were also a big part of the Great Society. But nonetheless, what I do want to start this discussion on is this war on poverty, what it involved. And Lyndon Johnson himself would introduce the term during his State of the Union address on January 8th, 1964, when he announced that his administration would begin waging a war on poverty. That same year, Johnson succeeded in passing the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964. Under the direction of Sergeant Shriver. Sergeant Shriver was the brother-in-law of John F. Kennedy, and Sergeant Shriver had actually been the head of the Peace Corps prior to this. But nonetheless, under the direction of Sergeant Shriver, the Office of Economic Opportunity was created to carry out the war on poverty. So what did this Office of Economic Opportunity do? Well, first of all, it created a Job Corps program. And this Job Corps program was a training program primarily for inner city youths aged 16 to 21. And this Job Corps program would be an alternative to that public works program that was recommended earlier by Secretary of Labor Wirtz. This was the alternative where the United States government is not going to hire people, but rather the United States government, through the Jobs Corps, is going to train them for jobs in society and help them again get a leg up and find employment. Well, in addition to the Job Corps, you would also have, related to the image that we see on the right here, Lyndon Johnson with a lot of African American and other youth, the Head Start program. He was big on education, as we'll see also later on this slide. But nonetheless, the Head Start educational program was for preschool-aged children to basically keep in line with those students who went to school, private preschools, and therefore had a certain advantage over those lower class and lower income Americans who were unable to go to preschool. Head Start would now essentially level the playing field for all students. Finally, you'd have something known as the Community Action Program. And what the Community Action Program did was it created a bunch of community action agencies, CAAs. And these community action agencies were premised on the idea that the poor should have, as you can see this quote on the screen, maximum feasible participation. And this gets to that idea that the war on poverty is going to funnel this money to these community action agencies to determine what their local communities need, and that's where the money would go to, whether it be education, whether it be job training, so on and so forth. But here's the thing. This idea of community action program and maximum feasible participation would be quite controversial. Why? Because what you're going to see happening is a lot of money is going to go to a lot of activist groups. And these activist groups, whether they be civil rights organizations or youth organizations, are going to use this money in controversial ways to give power to people that had been denied power in the past. So therefore, what you're going to see is a lot of city mayors angry that that money that was previously going to them was now being given to these community groups. But nonetheless, we see that here, Community Action Program, a key part of the Office of Economic Opportunity. But we also see other things that are sort of tangentially related to the war on poverty, but also separate as part of the larger Great Society. Education was key. In 1965, Congress and Lyndon Johnson passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which increased federal aid given to K-12 schools to great numbers. So what you're going to see, in fact, is between 1958 and 1968, the amount of federal monies given to education at the K-12 level would be 7% higher in that 10-year period. A lot of it had to do with this piece of legislation in 1965 that was meant to help those schools educating large numbers of low-income students, meaning students from families with incomes less than $1,000. Additional funds also went towards purchasing textbooks and library materials, and also the development of new curriculum in the languages, arts, and trades. So we have education being a key thing in this Great Society envisioned by Lyndon Johnson. Another big addition to the government's role in everyday life is the passage of legislation in 1965 that actually adds to Social Security, and this is known as Medicare and Medicaid. So what did this Medicare and Medicaid do? Well, it had three parts, parts A, B, and C. So we're going to break down each of those parts to help us understand what Medicare and Medicaid was in 1965. First of all, you would have Part A. Part A offered federal health insurance for hospitalization for Americans 65 years and older. Now, this would be paid for by Social Security taxes. So again, that's that linkage there with Social Security where the people themselves, the workers, would pay into that, and it would be matched by the federal government. Part B, provided voluntary insurance for doctor services, and this would be paid for by monthly contributions from individuals as well as federal contributions. Finally, so parts A and B deal with Medicare, and finally we have Part C, which creates Medicaid. And Part C created Medicaid, and it was a federal program providing federal insurance for the disabled and families with dependent children. So here we can see again, no other time since the New Deal had the federal government expanded so greatly as it did during this Great Society period. But nonetheless, always keep in the back of your minds how underfunded these programs were. So yes, they were a tremendous step in the right direction, but they didn't go as far as some liberals in particular wanted. But we see, despite this fact, growing disenchantment by 1966 with the Great Society. So why? Why did the Great Society essentially end here in 1966? Well, there were myriad reasons, most notably the Vietnam War. We'll talk about in the next lecture this phrase that Lyndon Johnson puts out there, guns and butter. He argued that the United States was a wealthy enough nation that they could afford both the guns that were being used in Vietnam as well as pay for the butter, i.e. the social programs in the United States. Well, as it turned out, that caused a lot of problems, particularly in the economy. Another reason why the Great Society ended. What we start to see already signs of in 1966 is the economy is becoming too hot, meaning that it is growing rates of inflation, and this will especially grow out of proportion in the 1970s, as we'll talk about in the future classes. So nonetheless, the Vietnam War, concerns about the Vietnam War, concerns about the economy, and finally, we're seeing growing racial strife during this period in 1966 and 1967, particularly urban riots. That gets a lot of people saying the Great Society is actually causing more harm than it actually is causing good. So nonetheless, let's talk about, to end today's lecture on this topic, the Great Society and poverty in America. Was the Great Society, despite some of its drawbacks that I mentioned and inadequacies, was it successful? Well, here's the thing. From the beginning, the war on poverty was extremely underfunded, as I said over and over, but it was also massively successful in reducing poverty in the United States. So I have these numbers on the screen that really give us this idea of how successful it was. So first of all, we're going to focus on one subset of Americans, older Americans living in poverty. As you can see, in 1959, well before the time of the Great Society, 40% of older Americans were living in poverty. By the time we go to 1970, that number will be down to 25%. But what about overall? What about all Americans? All Americans living in poverty in 1959 totaled 21% of the population. By the time we get to 1969, 10 years later, that number will almost be halved down to 12%. So clearly, this Great Society was phenomenally successful, especially given some of its limits. Spending, the lack of funding, the pushback in the 1960s and 1970s. And not only was it successful, but it was also long-lasting, particularly if you look at things like Medicare and Medicaid. They continue to exist despite the efforts, as we'll talk about in future classes, of conservatives trying to push back against the Great Society and so-called big government. So nonetheless, in the end, we see Johnson really equaling in many ways with his Great Society what was done with the New Deal of the 1930s.